Imagine, if you will, boarding a plane for what was supposed to be an easy, uneventful flight. You settle back into your seat, the engines roar to life, and before you know it, you are gliding easily over the Caribbean. All seems normal until it is not. Such is the story of West Caribbean Airways Flight 708, a flight that began like many others but ended in one of the most tragic air disasters Venezuela has ever seen. The next minute, Flight 708 swooped down at cruising altitude. Peaceful, expansive waters spread to the horizon below it. Then it plowed from the sky, leaving heartbreaks, confusion, and a million unanswered questions in its wake. What could possibly have caused this to occur? A pilot's miscalculation? A freak weather condition? Perhaps it went wrong with the plane itself. Something nobody saw coming? Join me now as we step through, step by step, over exactly what happened. We'll take the vital mistake, strange conditions, and each piece of this puzzle that led to disaster. By the end of the video, you'll be well informed as to why Flight 708 fell from the sky, and why it's a story the aviation world never forgets. Stick around while we unravel this tragic sequence of events minute by minute. This is a story of human error, unfortunate circumstances, and the haunting truth of how fast things can go amiss at 33,000 feet. Number 1. Timeline of events. Okay, so let's begin with the timeline of events. Flight 708 had departed Tocumen International Airport in Panama en route to Martinique. It was a routine charter flight, 152 passengers and 8 crew members, mainly returning to their destinations after a vacation. The aircraft reached cruising altitude of 33,000 feet and everything was in order, but just 40 minutes into the flight, things went suddenly and dramatically wrong. The problem started being identified in the engines by the pilots. Put simply, the engines were losing power, and the aircraft could not maintain the altitude. To the preliminaries general observation, it was nothing so serious yet, but it began to degenerate seriously. The crew resolved to seek an emergency descent, though the situation had already deteriorated at this juncture. The plane was in a stalled condition where the aircraft is no longer able to generate enough lift to stay airborne. It was too late for the pilots to try to recover control of it, however. Distress calls were broadcast, but the airplane was descending too fast. Minutes later, Flight 708 crashed in a very remote area of western Venezuela. The site was inaccessible that rescue teams took hours to reach the accident scene. No one survived. The crash site was a grim scenario. The debris was spread over a broad area, and the sorrow of families who would not see their loved ones again. The rescue teams had an enormously daunting task ahead of them. The woods in which the plane crashed were densely forested and impossible to access, making the disaster worse. Families nervously awaited news, hoping against hope for miracles that never were. This marked a turning point in regional aviation safety insofar as authorities visited each one of them trying to make sense of how such tragedy could befall. Number 2. Mistakes on the part of the pilot as well as crew management. The cause includes pilot error and crew mismanagement. One of the significant portions of the probe finds poor situational awareness. These pilots had engine flaws. They, however, could not assess the significance of their situation. They did not conduct appropriate procedures regarding stall handling. Their communication was uncoordinated and incomplete. It was as if each member of the crew was functioning in a vacuum and failed to know what another member was doing or thought. This idea of crew resource management is very central to air, making sure that every part of the crew is actually on the same page and working correctly. In the case of Flight 708, CRM completely broke down. The captain and the first officer were not cooperating with each other properly, and in a way the poor situation was made worse by that lack of coordination. Not only was the ineffectiveness of CRM a mere lapse, it was a critical failure that took on an overwhelming importance in the unfolding catastrophe. Lack of proper training was also a major factor. The findings of the investigation into the accident pointed to the fact that the pilots were not adequately trained about how to recover in cases of high altitude stalls. This set the stage in such a way that by the time the engine started to lose power due to icing up, the crew was totally unprepared for this emergency. Training is the core of safety in aviation, and in this case it cost lives. The probe said that such gaps were not limited to this flight system because for a long time there were deeper systemic issues at the airline. Number 3. Icing related issues and technical factors. The main technical factor of crash was icing of the engines. At higher altitudes, ice would form in the engine intake that reduces airflow and ultimately power loss. This is exactly what happened with Flight 708. The engines were losing power to result in icing, and the pilots did not act sufficiently in time to either prevent or moderate the icing. This wasn't only about ice forming on the engines, it was also about knowing how the conditions in which they flew might impact the aircraft. Instead of flying down to a lower elevation where it would have been warmer, the temperature and the ice would have melted. The crew kept the plane at 30,000 feet and attempted to determine what was wrong. This proved fatal. The engines continued to lose power until at last the plane entered a stall from which it could not recover. It's a shivering thought to realize that such a seemingly easy decision of going down might have made all the difference between life and death for everyone on board. The inquiry also found that de-icing systems of the aircraft were never activated. Whether this was from a lack of understanding or failure to realize the gravity of the situation is up for debate, but it can at least be said that failure in icing management played a large part in the crash. Experts noted there were obvious indications that the engine performance was compromised, and this necessitates urgent steps. However, the crew did not pay attention to or failed to understand the manifestations of these problems. Number 4. Speculations and theories. After the crash, many theories and speculations were postulated as to what really happened. In the end, some of these speculations were ruled out. In fact, due to exceptional stability of the weather, others, due to normality of loading and balancing of the aircraft. It was a truth much more complex, a series of small, seemingly manageable issues that, put together, led to catastrophic failure. In some documentaries like Air Disasters, it has been presumed that the crew was under stress because the airline was facing financial hardships. West Caribbean Airways was facing financial crisis, and its pilots experienced many instances of delayed payments. This had caused very low morale among the staff and rather high stress levels. Perhaps this stress was related to their poorly made decisions while flying. Imagine being thousands of feet up in the air, trying to handle a crisis, while at the same time worrying about whether you'd get paid that month. The pressure must have been simply enormous. Finally, the official inquiry would conclude that pilot error and engine icing were the primary causes for the crash. Still, speculation and theories creep around the crash. This gets to highlight the many ways in which different factors can creep into an aviation disaster, and how even little mistakes quickly snowball into a catastrophe. There were theories and allegations of sabotage and mechanical faults, but nothing could be proven by the evidence. This was simply the tragic end of a string of easily avoidable mistakes. Number 5. Collapse of West Caribbean Airways. Last, but definitely not the least, any discussion on the failures of West Caribbean Airways would be left incomplete without mentioning that the airline was in a shabby financial position, and this directly impacted safety. The investigation revealed that the airline was cutting corners, delaying maintenance, skimping on training, and putting pressure on pilots to fly under less than ideal conditions. It is a stark reminder of how business pressures can sometimes result in disastrous outcomes in industries where safety ought to rank above everything else. The pilots of Flight 708 received no training on what to do about the situation they encountered. The key reason that part of the failure would be why the airline inadequately invested in proper kinds of training programs for its pilots. Moreover, the financial burden the airline was struggling with had burdened the pilots by making them overwork and getting paid minimal wages. Such environment is a firewood for disaster because it brings about fatigue, demoralized crew, and ultimately, mistakes in the cockpit. It's not just financial pressure, it's something more, a cultural attitude from the airline, which essentially chose to concentrate on saving money at the expense of risk to its passengers and flying crew. The most basic reasons for the crash were there, lacked proper safety protocols and training. If the airline cared more about safety than cutting costs, the tragic loss of Flight 708 may well never have occurred. Subsequently, management at the airline came under heavy fire for its practices, but the crash opened the way to revisions in regulation and oversight for airlines similarly situated financially. Flight 708 is one of the tragedies that brought out a case study on what happens when money overrides people. So, what really happened in the West Caribbean Airways Flight 708? It was a perfect storm of contributing factors: error by the pilots, icing of the engines, poor training, and an airline struggling to stay above water. All these roles were played by the contributing factors in the tragedy that took the lives of 160 people. It is really bad because it feels like all those lives had been lost because of some series of errors and some oversights that could be looked at closely to prevent such a thing. This crash was, in fact, a grim reminder of the urgency for training, open communication, and care in the industry. It's a tragic story that shows just how fast things can go wrong, how important it is for everyone concerned with aviation to be ever prepared for the unexpected. The lesson learned from this tragedy are the changes that may inspire concerning changes in protocols meant for safety relating to aviation, yet they bring about vigilance and preparation that continues to occur. If you enjoyed this teardown, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into aviation mysteries and disasters. And let me know in the comments, what do you think was the most crucial factor in the crash of Flight 708? Would love to hear your thoughts. Let's keep moving on this conversation. Thanks for watching.